Hi there, I'm Sean Dern, and this is Queer Legends, an oral history podcast, the show where we sit down with the queer folks who helped build the rainbow and who helped build the world we get to live in today. This Queer Legends episode is a little different. It's a special collaboration with a podcast I co-created recently called Art Against Empire. It's a long-form documentary podcast series, pretty much like Queer Legends, and it's about the history of textiles as craft and art and resistance. And it's hosted by my amazing husband and Queer Legends executive producer, Ian Danger Capstick. Ian and I spent the last few months interviewing over 30 artists, curators, makers, and academics. And at the very last minute, Ian was able to sit down with the man who conceived the AIDS Memorial Quilt, Cleve Jones. In 1985, on a cold, rainy November night in San Francisco, with Harvey Milk's old bullhorn and a stack of posterboard, Cleve started the largest piece of community folk art in the world. And what you're about to hear is Ian's interview with Cleve, close to an hour, close to uncut, and it's a conversation that I really think you're going to want to hear. But before we get to it, here's a bit of context on who is Cleve Jones. Cleve Jones was born in Indiana in October of 1954 and grew up in a Pennsylvania house full of books. When he was 14 years old, his family moved to a suburb of Phoenix. And at 17, while hiding from bullies in his high school library, he found a copy of Life magazine with the headline, "Homosexuals in Revolt" on the cover, and he has said, often, that this was the moment he started to plan the rest of his life. In 1973, he made his way to San Francisco, enrolled at San Francisco State, and one afternoon walked into a camera shop on Castro Street run by a man named Harvey Milk. Milk became his mentor. Harvey Milk was 43 when Cleve met him, and he had already lived several lives. He'd been a Navy officer, a Wall Street researcher, and a Broadway stage manager before he landed in San Francisco and opened Castro Camera on a block that was becoming the gay village of the American West. Castro Camera wasn't really a camera shop. It was a campaign headquarters and a community center, and a living room for anyone who wandered in off the street. In November of 1977, on his third try for public office, Milk became the first openly gay man elected to major office in the state of California, and he called himself the mayor of Castro Street. A year later, he helped lead the coalition that defeated the Briggs Initiative, a statewide ballot measure that would have banned gay teachers from California's public schools. The speech he gave that year, again and again, had one line in it that people still write on posters: "You've got to give them hope." On Cleve's 24th birthday, Harvey Milk surprised him at a bar in the Castro with a donut and a single candle on top. 47 days later, on the morning of November 27, 1978, a former city supervisor named Dan White climbed through a basement window at City Hall, shot and killed Mayor George Moscone, and then walked down the hall and shot and killed Harvey Milk in his office. 7 years after that, on a cold November night in 1985, with the death toll in the Castro alone past 1,000 people, Cleve Jones stepped up at the Harvey Milk Candlelight March with Harvey's old bullhorn and asked the crowd to write the names of their dead loved ones on pieces of posterboard. The wall, with all of those names, looked back at him kind of like a quilt. What he built out of that night is the largest piece of community folk art in the world. Here is Ian's conversation with Cleve Jones.
Take me back to 1985. You conceived of this a couple of years before it actually became reality. So it rattled around and kind of was in you for quite a while. And in fact, a lot of people tried to keep it inside of you. People told you it was a terrible idea. They had they just didn't want to do it. What was it about the quilt that kind of kept you coming back until that finally that moment when you take the spray can and you say, you know, enough is enough. I'm just going to do the first panel.
Well, it sounds maybe romantic or silly or sentimental, but it really goes back to my grandmother's. I was the firstborn grandchild. I was a boy. They both loved me. My Nana was British. My grandma Helen came from a couple of small communities in central Indiana near Terre Haute, Brazil and Bee Ridge, Indiana. And neither side of the family really had any money, so they were frugal people. But my great-grandmother in the late 1800s sewed a series of quilts, one of which we still use here, and it's a working quilt. It's, for picnics, out on the grass. But when I was a little boy, my great-grandmother made a series of quilts that were put together with remnants from my great-grandfather's pajamas. Back then, even middle-class men wore elaborate, like silk pajamas and things. It was a bit, who knows, it was cool. And this quilt she made for me was perfect for a little boy. It had totem poles and dragons and Viking symbols and Chinese symbols and Japanese. It was just this kind of mix of fanciful creatures from different cultures all around the world, and I loved it. And so one of my earliest treasured memories is of being home with the flu or just on a cold night, and Mom would put this quilt around me and say, your great-grandmother loved you so much, she made this for you before you were born. She made it when she heard my parents got married in anticipation. So that really stuck with me. And then, later in life, I saw some of the quilts that had been made by enslaved and formerly enslaved people in the South. And I became kind of vaguely aware that there were traditions of quilt making as activism. But by 1985, I was just obsessed with the fact that we were being destroyed and there was no evidence. And so in 1985, as we were preparing for the annual tribute for Harvey Milk and George Moscone, where we light candles and walk down Market Street, the death toll in San Francisco alone had just hit 1,000. And of course, most of them were very concentrated in the Castro Street Upper Market area. And it's not an exaggeration for me to say I knew most of them. I mean, I didn't know all of them by name or had not been in all of their homes, but it was the bus driver, it was the baker, it was the mail carrier, the bartenders. It was just all the familiar faces that you see when you live in a densely populated neighborhood like that was very cohesive. So by 85, we were all just reeling from it. And then this awful thing was happening where, and this is still early in the pandemic, mind you. We're only 4 years into it at this point, but by 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying or caring for someone who was dying. And the grief was overwhelming, and it had a paralyzing effect. I could see people around me kind of shutting down. And so many of the normal ways of that people grieve together were denied from us because most of us had, been rejected by our faith traditions and families, and were on our own with chosen family who were dropping dead all around us. And it was very hard. And then also that was the internal part, but then the external reality that, I'm sorry, but I flunked biology in high school. I'm not stupid enough to think there's a gay virus. Decades later, I wasn't stupid enough to think there was a China virus. That's not how it works. So even as we were going through this misery, we all had some kind of understanding that this was happening around the world, that nobody was really looking at it. And now there's statistics, and the real tragedy hides behind the numbers. And then there's this one day when we're getting ready for the march, and the death toll had hit 1,000, and I had Harvey Milk's old bullhorn, and I'm up at the corner with stacks of posterboard and asked people to write the names of their friends and neighbors and loved ones who had already died. And we carried them with us, and I had some ladders hidden in the shrubbery by the old federal building, and we got a nun with a beard on a bicycle to distract the police, and it was cold, drizzly, wet night, and climbed up and taped all these names of our loved ones to the wall of this gray stone facade. And there were no speeches or music, and just all these hundreds of people standing in the rain whispering, and I knew him, I didn't know he was dead, I wish I had known, I would have helped, I would have tried, I didn't know. It was just, you could just feel this palpable yearning to find a way to grieve together and also to warn the world. And I got to the edge of the crowd and looked back at that patchwork of names on the wall, and I thought it looks like some kind of quilt. And I thought of my grandma's, and I thought of my great-grandmother back in Bee Ridge and the quilt she made from my great-grandfather's cast-offs. So that struck me as being a very middle-class, middle-American traditional family values sort of symbol for this disease that was killing homosexuals and IV drug users and sex workers and trans people. And I knew it was killing others, but we weren't seeing them yet. And I just thought this is the way to get behind the statistics. And I wanted to show, I kept imagining my neighborhood, which is beautiful restored Victorians, and there's cafes and there's restaurants and clubs. Castro Street has changed many, many times in the last 55 years, but there's always food, there's always drink, there's always music, there's always coffee, there's always homosexuals. And but I just got kind of obsessed with this notion that 1,000 people in those beautifully restored Victorians had died, and you couldn't tell. And I had this idea in my head that if we knocked the buildings down, if this was a meadow with 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then people would see it, and they would get it, and they would understand. And so anyway, that was the idea. And I made each quilt panel 3 feet by 6 feet to take up the approximate space of a grave. And of course, it's not a proper quilt at all. And we understood that from the beginning, but I liked the word quilt, and I liked what quilts represented, the use of usually cast-off materials, often very different textures, colors. In wealthy homes, that fabric would have been thrown away in the garbage. But if you're from a working-class family, from a farm family, if you're living in the back of a plantation, you want those for utility, for warmth. But these people also created works of art, works of great beauty. I also liked that it was perceived as largely a feminine form of art. The early representations of HIV were all about aggressive gay male sexuality. I wanted to soften it. And, we started the quilt the same year as ACT UP, which I totally supported, and I participated in ACT UP protests and was arrested with them a couple times. But I just kept thinking about my grandmothers, and, it was so hard to tell them. And I actually, with Grandma Helen, I never found the courage to tell her. And then one day we were driving. She used to love to go for drives, and we were up in Michigan and driving around in the country, and she was asking me about San Francisco and where I went to eat, because she used to go there with my papa. I said, well, I don't go out that much, but there's a neighborhood sushi bar that I go to pretty regularly, and I like to eat alone, and it's not awkward to be alone at a sushi bar. And she gave me this little look and this odd expression, and then she was silent for a while, and then she said, I've read that people with compromised immune systems should avoid raw fish.
Wow.
I had to pull over to the side of the road. I'm even now. But the point of this is my grandmothers, and I don't know anything about you or your family, but I have a feeling there's a real possibility that one of your grandmothers would have given her life if she felt she could save yours. And I think that's true of many grandmothers. And I just kept thinking, when I die of this disease, they're the ones that are going to grieve the most. But there's no place for them in the movement. They're not going to join ACT UP and put on Doc Marten boots and a black leather bomber jacket and storm the NIH. And I wanted to create a place. It was very deliberate. And I'm engaged in a project today that is kind of carrying through that theme of let us always try to broaden the ranks of the movement. Let us be diligent and thoughtful about creating avenues of participation, and that includes the vocabulary we use, the type of people we're willing to engage with, the patience we can muster to work through disagreements. But in my case, we created an entry point. And the critics were just so stupid. I mean, oh, it sounds morbid. Oh, it sounds expensive. Nobody sews anymore. And then the Larry Kramer saying, oh, great, Cleve, people should just sit around in their basements and sew quilts. Well, fuck off. That's not what we were saying. We were saying, do this part. It will help you heal from the grief that's in your heart. It's hard to sustain a movement just on anger. And also, there were some people, and Larry Kramer was one of them, in my view. And I loved Larry Kramer. I respected him. We were friends, but he contributed a lot to its perception as a gay disease. And that's troubling because whether people want to think about it or not, the overwhelming majority of people who lost their lives to HIV were heterosexual men and women and their children. And it played out differently here in much of America. But you asked me one simple question, and I haven't shut up.
Love it. I absolutely love it. No, and I wonder, do you, when you conceived of this incredible, what is now the largest piece of folk art in the world, could you have imagined your grandparents or your family seeing you then tour this quilt with some of the most powerful people in the entire world? I mean, not only did you get the attention of people who were otherwise at the time when you conceived of it refusing to even say the words AIDS, and when they did say it, they're laughing at it, to then many, many years later, you literally being there in the very same place as powerful decisions are made. Could they have ever conceived of something like that?
My parents and grandparents, I don't think. Nana and Grandma lived long enough to see what we did, and she was very, very proud. And my parents, my father it had been a tenuous relationship, but he was proud. I think the question is, could I have imagined that it would be so huge? And I did. I thought from the beginning, from that whole year when everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of, I just knew in my heart they were wrong. This was going to happen. It was going to be huge. It was going to be significant. It was going to make a difference. And it took a year of yakking about it and finally to say, well, but tell me that I'm just going to start. And I had persuaded a bare handful of folks to join me. So yes, I believed it would be big, but I didn't understand what big meant. It's one thing to have in one's mind that this could be a great tool for the media, but then to see it play out to the extraordinary degree that it did was magnificent. One can imagine that it could be healing for people who are deep in grief, to work with their hands, to sit in a room with friends and strangers and tell stories about their loved ones that have passed or the ones that are about to pass. We had people who would come in who were dying to make their own quilt panels. So one can imagine the sort of therapeutic value of such a thing, but until one sees it and feel, you have no idea, you know. Another thing I was not prepared for was the sheer artistry of it. The first ones that I made were horribly ugly. I have no artistic talents whatsoever, not a shred. And you know, I made the first one for Marvin Feldman, my dear friend, and he would have hated it. He would have wanted something that could have been in the Museum of Modern Art, or at least, you know, Bloomingdale's front window. And it was neither. It was spray paint. It was crap. And I always say, you know, Marvin had many friends who made quilt panels for him, and all but one of them are beautiful.
Yeah, but one of them's first. So how is it that you have... So I was kind of assuming, to be honest, that you were going to say something along the lines of, yeah, no, I knew it was going to be big, because you said this before. And I absolutely love this. But most people don't think that big. So obviously, you know, like walking around the Castro, Harvey Milk sees you, says, yeah, that guy thinks big. That guy thinks big enough that I'm going to invite him into my very small inner circle. And then you do big things. You do very, very big, multiple big things in your life. So what is it about you, Cleve, that allows you to think bigger than other people who are around you?
To be honest, I'm not a terribly introspective guy. I think I disappoint people with that sometimes. I don't like to be bored, and I don't like to be lonely. And so I have found over the decades that, and I have no hobbies. So I'm a boring old man, and this is kind of the only thing I enjoy. But I think also, I can't recall what year it was or how old I was, but I do know that our family was the last family on our block in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania, to get a television. My parents were academics. I grew up in a house filled with books. Just from floor to ceiling, in almost every room and hallway, it was books. And there were magazines, you know, every issue for the last 20 years of the New Yorker and the Partisan Review and Dance Magazine. My mother was a choreographer. My father was a psychologist. So there was a lot of, they were both political. So I grew up with words, and I also grew up with biographies and autobiographies. And so I became addicted to reading biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs. I would read a biography of anybody. It could be a scientist in a field that I had zero interest in, but I was intrigued by people who, you know, thought big and made big things happen. And I remember at a very early age, maybe fourth grade or fifth grade, saying, or my mother reported that I had said, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, well, I want to be someone that people would want to write books about. I just wanted to have that kind of life. And I also wanted to see the world. Because I read so much history, and so many of the biographies that I read were of people who immigrated to this country. And so I did. As soon as I got out of high school, I just launched myself out into the world and hitchhiked and bummed around for years and years and years. And I developed a great love of people during that time. So I think that combination of reading so many biographies and then getting out in the world early in life and not being like the typical American. The typical American does not have a passport. I have neighbors 100 yards from where I'm sitting right now who are terrified to leave this county. It's a great failing of American culture. We don't see the world enough. But when you do, and you come to see the kindness and the commonalities, and I'm not afraid of Muslims. I've been in too many Muslim homes. People down the street are, they're terrified. Anyway, see what happens. You ask me a simple question, I just blah, 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 blah.
How this works, especially with a documentary. I just nod and you keep talking, and it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. I mean, you talked about enduring friendships, and I guess one of the friendships for you, perhaps, that endured the longest, or at least for Gilbert Baker, it was one of his longest friendships, was with you, though tumultuous at times. You were literally there, not at the birth of two major textiles resistance moments, but two. Not just the first one, which you created, but the birth of the pride flag. You were quite literally there. You witnessed it, but you also fought for it, i.e., Gilbert is a wonderful artist, but it took you making some interventions with some pretty tough cookies to make it actually a reality, to get them the supplies and the money and all of everything that they needed. Tell me about that moment. Sylvester's on the speakers. It is loud.
Well, so Gilbert and I were both into big fabric. He was into drag. That was not my thing, but I couldn't pull it off. But so Gilbert was into being a seamstress and creating drag and creating political drag. There was also there were a few things that happened at that time. That one of them was something called Judy Chicago's Dinner Party. And so this was a really fascinating piece for us because she was a feminist artist, and she created this concept of this table and then invited other women artists to come in and create the different components of it. So it was a pretty fascinating example of collaborative, collective artists, a collaborative artistic process. Also, we were both Vietnam era kids, so we were both very moved by Maya Lin's design for the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Now, of course, that was not fabric, stone, but very simple, with just this repetition of names and the way that people interacted with it. It was unlike going to visit a statue where maybe people might leave a flower or something or just take a picture. But when people approach the Vietnam Memorial, they go, they touch it. Often they embrace the wall. They find the name etched in of their relative. They'll take a piece of paper and trace it over. There's that combination of that dignity and simplicity and the touching it. And then another thing that happened was Christo and Jean-Claude did the Running Fence, which was this gorgeous installation, largely here in Sonoma County, where I live now. And it was this huge fence that went over hills and valleys and streams, and it was this opalescent fabric that changed in color and luminosity as the sun rose and set, and also it was a colossal pain in the ass to deal with the bureaucrats that attempted to stop him. And at one point in one of his interviews, he said, battling the bureaucratic process is part of my artistic process. And I thought, oh, you go, and also it required thousands of volunteers. It was just really labor intensive. So this was what Gilbert and I grew up in. And then also there was this conversation about what was the symbol for this community that is now today called LGBTQ+. Back then it was the gay community, becoming the gay and lesbian community. It was still called Gay Freedom Day. And the symbols that we had were the lambda, the Greek letter L, which to me was incomprehensible. Like, what the fuck? What does that mean? Why the lambda? And I've since read many explanations for how that happened, and each has left me more confused. Then the other symbol we had was the pink triangle. And at that point, its usage was still pointing down. This was before ACT UP reclaimed it and turned it upside down as a symbol of resistance. But I remember Gilbert saying, well, there's a problem with the pink triangle. And somebody said, well, what's that? And he said, Hitler, and did we want that symbol of mass murder to be associated with us? So there was this conversation. And then when Gilbert, when we were able to get him a little bit of money to do the decorations for Pride, and he was hanging out with this straight hippie girl named Fairy. And there have been a lot of rainbows already in San Francisco. I mean, it was hippy dippy. Rainbows have been symbols forever and ever and ever in every culture. I mean, it's rainbows. Fairy was really into rainbows. And then Gilbert did his drawings. I saw them and I thought, oh, because they were huge. The first two flags were enormous. I don't know if I've ever seen a flag that big. I mean, I haven't since. And so on one side, there's this conversation going on with Gilbert, with Harvey Milk, with a guy named Hank Wilson, others about how the movement needed a symbol. But we weren't talking about a flag. This is another thing that sort of gets lost sometimes when people talk about, I mean, now we have all these flags. We've got the pride flag, we got the leather flag, we got the trans flag, we got the non-binary flag, we got the lesbian firecracker flag or whatever it is with all the, and that had not happened before. There were symbols, there were logos, brands, if you will, but the idea of a flag for the movement and the community, that was brand new to Gilbert. And then that day, when we raised them up on the flagpoles at UN Plaza, and this gorgeous clear blue day, and the wind is snapping them, and all the hundreds of thousands of people who were marching in Pride that day had to walk between them, and we just stood there on the side and looked at the faces of the people as they walked under those flags and looked up. And that was when we both knew that what was going to happen. And that's the other thing Gilbert has to get credit for, is that, well, he and I both know, you can have all the greatest ideas in the world, but people are not going to leap up to help you, particularly in our community. There's this whole undercurrent that comes from a very unhealthy place. So we both had to battle, and we fought each other a lot too. He could be a complete pain in the ass. And he would drive me crazy because he had, I mean, I'm crazy too, but I live in the real world, okay? I have my feet on the ground. Maybe I took less acid back in the day, but, Gilbert was sometimes just batshit crazy. And he also had this grandiosity born of insecurity. And what I always understood about Gilbert was that he'd been so badly damaged by his Christian fundamentalist family. And he was, our generation of gay men, we it was not easy. And I don't think any of us don't have some scar tissue. But with Gilbert, it would present as this grandiosity. And he would say, okay, I'm going to do this. And I would say, okay, well, if you want to do that, I think I can find funding here. And let's move that forward. Let's write a little grant. And then just as it was starting to happen, he would blow it up and he would say, no, I want to do this instead. And so there were times when we would just scream at each other. And there was one period where I wouldn't talk to him for a couple of years. I was just like, bitch, please. No, you do too much. I missed him terribly the whole time. I guess he was, I don't know.
And you reconciled in the end. You invited him out to your place, made amends both directions.
And immediately started laughing. Yeah, no, we loved each other very much. I think of him every day. I'm involved in a big project now, and I 2 or 3 times a day, I find myself just reaching for the phone to call him. And we were such great collaborators. Like right now, I'm working with a team of people who, I love it when I can work with a good team and I can say to somebody, I can't draw, you can draw. I have a picture in my head. It looks kind of like this. And then they come back to me with it. I had ChatGPT before the robots.
But that says something about your collaboration, your long-standing collaboration with artists, and being an engine and being somebody who lifts them up, centers their work. Tell me about that. Why creative resistance? What is the magic about symbols?
Well, I have a lot of experience in basic retail politics. I have a lot of movement work. And it's a little different, I think, for younger people today, because when I was starting out, it really was about trying to change the culture, trying to change the hearts and minds of the people about issues that of which they were ignorant, or there was stigma. And I have always understood the power of pop culture. I've seen it play out. I've seen how dramatic cultural shifts can occur with extraordinary speed sometimes. And it's about, when I was first starting, I think it was before I even left Arizona, I was probably 17, and this slightly older grad student said that old cliche that people liked to say back then. I don't know if they say it anymore, but they would say, you can't legislate morality. But actually you can, because if you say that something is wrong, that begins to establish a moral grounding for your opinion. And then the popular culture part of it, I was so sad when Rob and Michelle Reiner passed. I mean, they were friends of mine, so there was that pain, but also just, they were among those who used popular culture to shape the morality of the American people. Bad Bunny is doing it today. The film Milk made a difference. We were criticized for not having an out gay actor play Harvey. Excuse me, get real. Sean Penn played Harvey Milk. And millions of people saw it as a result. And the portrayal was stunning. One of the things that's been on my mind that I haven't succeeded in doing yet, but just how I'm upset about the portrayal of working class men in our culture. It's all comedic. They're all Homer Simpson or Peter Griffin. And working class men, many of them are actually heroes who work long, hard hours to support their families. So, but the popular culture representations matter. Anyway, I'm rambling now. But I want to change people's minds, and you have to find them where they're at. And if they're watching cable TV or they're reading People magazine, then that's where you need to be.
That's a huge lesson for anybody who's involved in creative resistance. You've gone on to do more projects than the ones that people immediately know. What does Cleve Jones do today? What do you want people to know keeps you busy and what keeps you hopeful? What projects are you working? I want to know more about this project you've mentioned. If you
This is going to be, I'll tell you what I'm working on because it's huge and I'm really
Great.
excited about it. And that I love it. For me, well, you are never going to find me golfing. You're never going to find me making a quilt. You may find me making dinner. No, I like to organize. So right now I've been working with this small team of super smart people, and we're working very hard. I've been putting in like 10, 12 hours a day since December. It started December 1st when President Trump decided to cancel World AIDS Day and tell federal employees they couldn't participate. Now that was a petty, stupid, ridiculous thing to do and doesn't even compare with the damage he did when he canceled USAID, and which has already resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, mostly children, and will result in the deaths of many millions more across the planet if the funding's not restored. So, but anyway, I got angry about World AIDS Day, and then one day I was talking to somebody in our despair and anger, and I said, God damn it, how long have we been doing this? And then I realized it's that June 5th, it will be 45 years since the first published word of what we now call HIV/AIDS. It was in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, published by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. That was June 5th, 1981. So I can't do math in my head, so I asked my phone, subtract 1981 from 2026, and it came up with 45. And then I asked my phone, how many people on this planet will have died of AIDS by June 5th, 2026? And the answer came back 45 million. There it was in my head, 45 million, 45 years, 45 million dead, no vaccine, no cure, AIDS isn't over. And then to compound it was the realization that the breakthroughs of Gilead in creating a twice-a-year formulation for pre-exposure prophylaxis, which means that now people can just go in twice a year, get an injection, and they can't transmit or get HIV. This is a milestone and could really contribute to increasing the access to PrEP, mitigating some of the racial disparities that still play out so grievously. So you could really say that even without a vaccine and a cure, though research has been moving forward on a vaccine and cure, that we were on the brink of victory through treatment as prevention. And now, because of this administration, we're on the precipice of a whole new wave of infections and deaths and misery. So I called up my buddy Sean Strube, and we began calling all the people that we know in the HIV/AIDS world, which is a lot. And everyone said, yeah, we've got to, observe this terrible milestone anniversary. But it can't just be about AIDS. It can't just be about LGBTQ. Medicine is under attack. Science is under attack. The entire healthcare system of the United States of America is under attack, and the support that we have offered nations around the world has been cut, decimated, destroyed. So it's got to be the bigger picture. It's got to be, why are Black women in America 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than their white counterparts? It's about the Veterans Administration. Despite the promise we made to those who serve in our military, they're gutting the Veterans Administration. It's about cutting childhood cancer research. It's about stalling vaccine development. It's the whole ball of wax. And it's also an administration that tells people that compassion and empathy are weaknesses. So out of that came a campaign. We're launching it this week, actually. It's called 7 Days in June. And in the United States, we're going to do town halls and marches and rallies and interfaith services requiring all of the politicians that are running for office to address the issue of healthcare. It's called 7 Days in June. Health is primary. It's nonpartisan, of course, but we want every voter who might be wavering or uncertain to think about the impact. And so it's a huge national campaign, but the goal And it's got all sorts of bells and whistles, and at the end of the day, it's about generating local media coverage of the local impact on health budgets by the federal cuts, the $1 trillion they're taking from Medicaid. And then the international component, for those of you who might see this from outside the United States, is we're asking everywhere on Friday, June 5th at sunset to hold candlelight vigils to honor the lives of those who have already been lost and the millions more who will certainly die if funding's not restored. And it's endorsed by the AFL-CIO and the Nurses Union, the Teachers Union, the union I work for, the Hospitality Workers Union. So starting next week, we're going to just be doing this for about 2 months.
I love it. Absolutely love it. I know where I'll be on June 5th then is down here in Montreal. We have a memorial park here, and my husband and I will make sure that, we helped save the park a little while back, but we'll make sure that we're down there. Because again, like you, on a smaller scale, we know all the HIV folks here in town as well. And that sounds like a really important cause to rally behind. One last really sort of big question, which is your idea and your passion and your making it happen has inspired a whole way of activism. I don't know, maybe it does surprise you that quilters are the first people to defend the AIDS quilt as being a legitimate quilt, by the way. So rest assured.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, the quilt police, this is what we call them, but they called off that tickets and those fines well back in the 90s when they realized how important it was. No, honestly, and every now and then, yes, this idea pops up, oh, it's not a quilt. But, the other thing is, it is a lot like a Hmong story cloth. It is a lot like an arapeya. It is a lot like Queen Liliuokalani's story quilt and Harriet Power's quilt. And it is a lot like all of those things, which many of those things also didn't have 3 layers with batting in the middle and stitches. A lot of those things were beautiful appliqued statements like banners. And there is a lineage that is truly owned by those folks. And I think of people like David Shannon, the incredible quilter, whose queer work was censored in the mid-1990s because it was a tribute to to people he lost. And it didn't even have to say that AIDS or HIV on the quilt at all. It just needed 2 skeletons and the implication that those people were men for it to literally be pulled from a quilt show. I guess the bigger question here, though, is, countless countries. We have one here in Canada, the AIDS quilt. It lives sadly in some hockey bags in a storage locker, which is a very Canadian thing. And we're going to try and figure out a way to get it out of there. UK, Scotland, all over the place, Australia. But another thing that you've done here that you may not know is that, every cause has a quilt. How does that feel that you re-enlivened or created quite literally an entire sort of other way of legitimately protesting? That's huge.
Thanks. Thank you. The UK quilt disappeared for years. I think it disappeared for 30 years. And then about not even a year ago, last June, I think, I was just, doom scrolling, and this thing popped up about how there was going to be a display of the UK AIDS quilt the following week at Tate Modern. I love Tate Modern. The last time my mom was able to travel, we took her home to London and we went to a show at Tate, and I was just blown away. It was late one night. I think, wow, they found the UK quilt. They restored it. I didn't know it's going to be displayed at Tate. And I went online, and the last minute airfare from San Francisco to Heathrow was just exorbitant. I don't have any money, so I can't afford it. And I couldn't sleep, and the next morning I thought, if I don't go to that, I'm going to regret it for the rest of my life. I'm English. My mother, I'm a British citizen, actually. And Mom and Nana and So I spent the money and I went, and I told them 2 days before that I was coming, and they asked if they could book me for a speech at the Tate, and that sold out immediately. And it was a good crowd, and then the next morning I show up, and clearly there's some other huge event going on, because I don't know how I can even get to the front doors of Tate because there's too many people, and whatever this other thing is, it's just this huge line snaking around the block. And then as I try to figure out how to get in, I realized that 70,000 people showed up in June to see the quilt. Yeah. You know, a few miles from where my mother grew up, and there were a lot of young people and people of color and immigrants, and there it was, you know, all these decades later, just still doing what it does. The volunteers that were there were so sweet and kind. Yeah. You know, I've met a lot of famous people. I've met a lot of powerful people, and with very few exceptions, none of them will be remembered even 25 years from now. People just disappear, and 50 years from now, you think about who was making popular music 100 years ago. You can think of maybe a handful of names, but people disappear and are forgotten. But sometimes the things we do live on. And my hope is that, well, I don't think anyone 100 years from now will remember the name Cleve Jones. I have a feeling that the quilt will be remembered. And that's pretty cool.
I know it will. I mean, it's digitized. It exists in places and spaces where future researchers and historians, just like we, obsess over the signatures on signature quilts today and ask, who are these people? Who are and who made these abolitionist quilts? So too will our ancestors ask, who was Cleve Jones? You know, who was Marvin Feldman? Who are these people? And they'll learn that somebody really loved a lot of these people. And there are artifacts and elements that are literally stitched in that they can't be forgotten. And an entire institution now to take care of these things, which we didn't even get to talk about. But we are coming in on the end of our time, and I just want to say thank you on behalf of an entire community of people. I'm sure you get lots and lots of thanks, but you and your work have been a constant inspiration for me and the work that I have done. I'm 45 now, and yours was one of the very first queer activists and LGBT activist name that I ever heard. And I often thought to myself, I really want to be like that person. And again, so just thank you on behalf of so many of us who are not only inspired by you, but challenged by you in really good ways. You know, and with that, I'll just recommend that folks read your book because it is incredible, and learn more about you, and just say another just massive heartfelt thing.
Thank you very much.
So that was Cleve Jones. In 1978, Cleve danced beside Gilbert Baker as he imagined a rainbow, and stood beside Gilbert as he watched the first rainbow flag rise. 5 months later, Harvey Milk was dead. 7 years after that, the death toll in the Castro had passed 1,000, and Cleve imagined a quilt big enough to name them all. Gilbert sewed some of the first panels. They had their ups and downs, but in the end, they were chosen family. When Gilbert passed unexpectedly in 2017, Cleve wrote, "My dearest friend in the world is gone. Gilbert Baker gave the world the rainbow flag. He gave me 40 years of love and friendship." Thank you, Cleve Jones, and thank you, Gilbert Baker, for being chosen family. I don't think either one could have accomplished what they did without the other. And on June 5th, please light a candle for those we've lost. I'm Ian Danger Capstick, and this has been a bonus episode of Art Against Empire, co-created by Sean Dern and a production of Secret Agents. Until Until next time, keep making, keep resisting, and remember, our hands know how to build the world we want.